Sarah and David had been together for 5 years, and now they were ready to take the next big step in their relationship, moving in together. They found a charming old house for rent in a quiet neighborhood. The house was perfect: 3 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a backyard large enough for their golden retriever Max. The rent was surprisingly low, but they didn't question their good fortune. The landlord, Mr. Thompson, was a thin, elderly man with a stooped posture and a nervous demeanor. He handed over the keys with a shaking hand. "It's a good house," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Just try to respect its history." Sarah and David exchanged puzzled looks but shrugged it off. They were too excited about their new home to worry about an old man's cryptic warnings. First few days were spent unpacking and making the house their own. Sarah loved the vintage wallpaper and the creaky wooden floors. David was excited about the basement, which he planned to turn into a man cave. Everything seemed perfect until the first night. Their first night in the house was uneventful. They fell asleep exhausted from the move. However, in the early hours of the morning, Sarah was awakened by a strange noise. It was a faint scratching sound, like nails on a chalkboard. She nudged David awake, but by the time he stirred, the noise had stopped. "Probably just the house settling," he mumbled, turning over and falling back asleep. But the next night, the scratching returned. This time, it was louder and seemed to come from the walls themselves. Sarah lay still, her heart pounding. She swore she could hear whispers just beyond the edge of comprehension. The following day, they noticed other strange occurrences. Objects would move on their own. Picture frame would be tilted. A chair would be slightly out of place. Max, usually a calm and friendly dog, began to growl at empty corners and refused to go into the basement. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah and David decided to explore the house more thoroughly. They started with the basement. David pulled out an old, dusty chest from a corner, and inside they found a collection of old photographs and journals. The journals belonged to a man named Robert Miller, who had lived in the house during the early 1900s. As Sarah read through the entries, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Robert Miller was a reclusive man, rumored to be involved in dark rituals. His journal detailed strange experiments and summoning rituals. One entry caught Sarah's eye. November 12, 1908. "I have done it. The ritual was a success. Spirits are bound to this place, as am I. No one must disturb the circle or the consequences will be dire." Sarah's hands shook as she showed the journal to David. "We need to leave," she whispered. "This house is cursed." But David was skeptical. "It's just an old journal," he said. "We can't leave just because of some creepy stories." That night, the house came alive with activity. Doors slammed shut on their own, lights flickered, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Max whimpered and hid under the bed. Sarah and David huddled together in fear, hearing disembodied voices and footsteps echoing through the halls. In the dead of night, they heard a loud crash from the basement. Mustering their courage, they went to investigate. The chest they had opened earlier was now overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. The walls were scratched with deep, jagged lines, and a foul odor filled the air. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the basement, and they heard a low, guttural growl. A shadowy figure appeared, its eyes glowing with malevolence. "You should not be here." "Yes." They fled the basement, slamming the door behind them. Sarah was in tears, and David's face was pale. "We have to get out of here," she sobbed. But as they ran for the front door, it slammed shut, the force that shook the house. They were trapped. Desperate and terrified, Sarah and David contacted a local paranormal investigator, Claire Matthew. Claire arrived the next morning, her face set in a determined expression. He had dealt with haunted houses before, but something about the Thompson house felt different, darker. Claire set up her equipment around the house, placing cameras and audio recorders in key areas. She also carried a bundle of sage and other cleansing tools. "We'll need to perform a thorough investigation," he explained, "but I can already sense a strong presence here." As night fell, Claire began her investigation. She started in the basement, where the activity seemed strongest. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the temperature plummeted as she descended the stairs. She lit the sage and began to walk around the room, chanting a cleansing prayer. Suddenly, the lights flickered and a voice echoed through the basement. "Leave? Now." Claire held her ground. "I command you to leave this place," he said firmly, continuing her cleansing ritual. The shadowy figure appeared again, but this time, it was joined by several others. They surrounded Claire, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. The house shook as if in protest, and the figures grew more aggressive. Claire felt a hand grab her arm, icy and strong. She struggled, continuing her chant. "Spirits of this place, you are not welcome here. Leave now and find peace." The figures writhed and twisted, their whispers turning into anguished cries. Walls seemed to close in, and Claire felt herself being pulled into darkness. But she didn't relent. She reached for a vial of holy water and threw it at the nearest figure. There was a blinding flash of light, and the figures recoiled, screaming. The oppressive energy lifted, and the room grew still. Claire sank to her knees, exhausted but victorious. She had driven the spirits back. She knew it was only a temporary reprieve. She hurried back upstairs to find Sarah and David. "We need to finish this," she said. "There's a ritual that must be completed to break the curse permanently." Claire explained that they needed to perform a ritual to cleanse the house and release the trapped spirits. They would need to find the circle mentioned in Robert Miller's journal and destroy it. They searched the house and eventually found a circle hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the attic. It was drawn in dark, almost dried blood, surrounded by strange symbols. Claire began the ritual, lighting candles and sprinkling salt around the circle. She recited an incantation, calling upon the spirits to leave and find peace. Sarah and David stood by her side, holding hands and praying for the nightmare to end. As Claire completed the ritual, the house shook violently. The shadowy figures appeared once more, their forms writhing in agony. But this time, instead of attacking, they seemed to be drawn towards the circle. One by one, they were pulled into it, disappearing in flashes of light. The last figure was Robert Miller himself. His eyes were filled with regret and sorrow as he was drawn into the circle. "Forgive me," he whispered before vanishing. The house grew silent, and the oppressive energy lifted. Claire collapsed, exhausted but relieved. "It's over," she said. "The spirits are free." In the weeks that followed, Sarah and David noticed a dramatic change in the house. The strange occurrences stopped, and the house felt warm and welcoming. Max was his old playful self again, no longer growling at empty corners. They invited Claire over for dinner to thank her for her help. As they sat in the living room, they couldn't help but feel a sense of peace and gratitude. The haunted house that had once filled them with fear was now a place of comfort and joy. Sarah and David decided to stay in the house, determined to make new, happy memories. They planted a garden in the backyard and filled the house with laughter and love. The Thompson house, once a place of darkness and despair, had been transformed. It was no longer haunted by the past, but filled with hope for the future. And so, Sarah and David began their new life together, in a house that was now truly a home.